America couldn't believe what it was watching. A woman who built her entire persona on bravado, defiance, and unshakable confidence was now reduced to a trembling voice, her words cracking under the weight of desperation. Karoline Leavitt, once the loudest fighter in the room, leaned forward as if closeness alone could soften the blow. She begged, not demanded. She pleaded, not preached. And at the center of it all was one staggering number that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud: $80 million. Her words tumbled out in fits, almost stumbling over themselves. "Please, Jasmine. We don't need to take this any further. 80 million. It's too much. No one could survive that." The sound of it, 80 million, rolled like thunder, louder than her voice, louder than her logic, echoing in the minds of everyone listening. It wasn't just money. It was the measure of a reckoning, the price of accountability she never thought would reach her. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, unmoved. Her eyes carried no flicker of sympathy, no twitch of hesitation. She didn't interrupt. She didn't console. She simply let the silence stretch, let Karoline's desperation fill the room until it became suffocating. Crockett's stare was cold, not out of cruelty, but out of something far more powerful: conviction. She knew this wasn't her burden, this wasn't her shame, and she refused to make it easier for the one who had crossed the line. The cameras caught everything: the slight quiver in Leavitt's lip, the tightening of her hands, the way her voice grew thinner with each sentence. America watched in stunned disbelief as the once composed Republican spokesperson now looked like a gambler out of chips, begging the House not to take her last card. And in that stillness, Crockett's silence became louder than any outburst could ever be. The contrast was cinematic. One woman unraveling, the other rooted like stone. And in that contrast, something deeper was revealed. This wasn't merely a legal battle. It was a moral collision, a desperate plea colliding with an unshaken principle. But to understand why Leavitt was begging, we need to rewind. The number alone, $80 million, was enough to rattle even the most unshakable figure in politics. For Karoline Leavitt, it wasn't just an amount written on paper. It was the kind of number that devoured reputations, that hollowed out bank accounts, that could end not only a career, but the myth of invincibility she had spent years building. To the outside world, Leavitt was supposed to be untouchable, the bold young voice who never flinched. Yet in the shadow of that lawsuit, all the polish cracked. The lawsuit wasn't a quiet, behind-the-scenes skirmish. It was public, brutal, and symbolic. 80 million was more than damages. It was a price tag stamped across her political future. Every news outlet flashed it in headlines. Every commentator dissected it on primetime. Every opponent whispered it with glee. And the country wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Waiting to see if arrogance would finally face its bill. For Leavitt, this was political survival. Her image had always been crafted on confrontation, on going for the jugular, on dismissing critics with a smirk. But lawsuits are different. They're not debates you can shout through. They're not television segments you can spin. They're slow, merciless, and binding. The courtroom doesn't care about your sound bites. And Jasmine Crockett knew that. That's why she held the line, refusing to fold, refusing to give Leavitt the mercy she begged for. Because to Crockett, this wasn't just about dollars. It was about principle. She had seen too many moments where power was abused, where insults went unchecked, where bigotry hid behind political discourse. For her, this lawsuit was bigger than one insult or one clash. It was about telling every immigrant, every woman of color, every voice dismissed as other, that there was a line that could not be crossed without consequence. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Leavitt walked away, her arrogance would be rewarded, her brand preserved, her future intact. If Crockett held firm, the case would become a precedent, a symbol, a ripple that reminded America that arrogance is not invincibility, and that's why this battle mattered. This wasn't just about Karoline. It was about every rising star who thought arrogance could outshine accountability, every politician who thought insults were strategy, every voice that assumed wealth, connections, and youth could shield them from consequence. Crockett's refusal to bend was not silence. It was a warning. And America felt the tension. Social media feeds exploded with speculation. Would Karoline settle? Could Crockett really win? Was this the end of Leavitt's fast rise, or just another chapter in her legend? Clips of her desperate pleas were shared with captions dripping in disbelief. Commentators debated whether this was the beginning of a new standard in politics, or simply the collapse of another overhyped persona. The cameras captured the stakes in her trembling voice. It wasn't just a woman asking for mercy. It was an entire career on trial, an entire image collapsing in real time. And the silence of Jasmine Crockett, cold, calm, unflinching, made it clear. This wasn't a negotiation. It was judgment. What came next would change everything. To understand the desperation in Karoline Leavitt's voice, you have to rewind to the persona she built long before the $80 million figure loomed over her. Karoline didn't stumble into the spotlight by accident. She engineered her rise with calculation, ambition, and an unshakable belief that confidence, no matter how hollow, was power. She wore arrogance like armor, striding into interviews and debates with the smirk of someone convinced that youth itself was enough to bulldoze decades of experience. She was, in many ways, a perfect storm for controversy. Brash, untested, and eager to prove that she could swing harder than anyone else, Karoline turned every confrontation into performance. She mocked, she jeered, she made her name by tearing others down. To her supporters, it looked like strength. To her opponents, it looked like reckless cruelty. And to Karoline, it was strategy. She believed that in a political world addicted to spectacle, the loudest voice always won. But arrogance has a way of multiplying. Each time she escaped consequence, she grew bolder. Every headline where her insults went viral reinforced the idea that she was untouchable. She crafted an image of herself as the rising star who feared nothing, who could talk over anyone, who could rewrite the rules simply by refusing to acknowledge them. Her bravado became her brand. Yet behind closed doors the cracks showed. Former colleagues whispered about the anxiety that seeped in when cameras were gone, the endless need for validation, the way she measured her worth not in principles, but in attention. She could command a room when the spotlight was on, but in private moments she replayed criticism with obsessive intensity, needing to be reassured that her mask of confidence had held. The contrast was stark. The public warrior versus the private warrior. Still, Karoline leaned into the myth she had created. She dismissed warnings, underestimated adversaries, and convinced herself that charm and defiance could smooth over anything. That was her fatal flaw, believing that every opponent would eventually fold under pressure, that no one could withstand the sharp edge of her ambition. And then came Jasmine Crockett. From the very beginning, Karoline treated her as just another target, just another name to bulldoze on her path upward. She underestimated her, dismissing Crockett's composure as weakness, her calm as passivity. Karoline mistook dignity for fragility, and in doing so, she walked straight into the trap of her own arrogance. The lawsuit was the embodiment of that miscalculation. $80 million wasn't pulled from thin air. It was the tangible price of Karoline's pattern. A lifetime of sharp words and unchecked overconfidence had finally collided with someone who refused to be dismissed, someone who wouldn't shrink under insult, someone who believed that principles outweighed intimidation. And as the number flashed across headlines, Karoline's myth of invincibility began to crumble. The bravado that once carried her now looked like recklessness. The arrogance that made her magnetic to some now appeared as fragility disguised as strength. The very traits that had fueled her rise were now fueling her downfall. It was cinematic, in a way, a classic villain arc. Overconfidence swelling until it tipped into collapse. A star blinded by her own reflection, unable to see the iceberg ahead. The more Karoline tried to cling to her old tactics, the more the world saw through them. Each desperate plea revealed the contradiction. The woman who mocked weakness was now begging not to be crushed by her own. And that's why her begging moment struck America so deeply. It wasn't just the shock of hearing her voice break. It was the realization that the character she had sold the country, a fearless fighter, a rising powerhouse, was never built to last. She had written herself into a story where arrogance would always triumph, but life had delivered a plot twist. But while Karoline projected power, Jasmine Crockett's past revealed why she was the one person she should never have underestimated. If Karoline Leavitt's story was one of arrogance mistaken for power, Jasmine Crockett's was one of resilience forged into unshakable strength. Long before she stood across from Leavitt, unflinching in the face of desperate pleas, Crockett had been tested in fires Karoline couldn't begin to imagine. Her story was not polished in the halls of privilege, but carved out in struggle, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Crockett was the kind of figure who carried her scars like medals. She didn't pretend the road had been easy. She embraced the fact that it hadn't. Growing up, she understood early what it meant to be dismissed, what it meant to be told you didn't belong, what it meant to push forward anyway. That understanding became the core of her strength, the very thing that later made her immune to Karoline's taunts and insults. Her path into politics wasn't driven by vanity or ambition, but by necessity. Before she was ever a legislator, she was a fighter in courtrooms, a voice for the voiceless. She defended those who couldn't defend themselves, often for little recognition and less reward. She knew what it was like to stand alone against systems that seemed impossible to bend. And in those battles, she learned the value of dignity, not as a slogan, but as a survival tool. There were sacrifices along the way, nights spent away from family, paychecks that barely covered the basics, exhaustion that clung to her like a shadow. But every sacrifice became part of the story she carried into the political arena. It made her credible in a way that Leavitt could never match. When Crockett spoke about justice, it wasn't theory, it was lived experience. When she held the line, it wasn't theatre, it was muscle memory from years of holding ground. When it would have been easier to give in, and through it all she maintained a calm dignity. Even when provoked, even when underestimated, she refused to descend to the level of insults or theatrics. That calm wasn't weakness. It was strength disguised as stillness. Because Crockett understood something her opponents never did. The louder someone yells, the more it reveals their fear. And she had learned not to fear the noise. This wasn't just a politician. This was a woman forged in battles Karoline couldn't even imagine. Crockett had seen what it meant to truly fight for survival, to protect people who had no one else in their corner. Compared to that, Leavitt's sharp words were nothing but paper cuts. Crockett's silence wasn't passive. It was purposeful. Every pause, every cold stare, Every refusal to indulge Karoline's theatrics was a decision born from experience. Her credibility grew not from sound bites, but from consistency. Constituents saw it. Colleagues felt it. Even critics, begrudgingly, recognized it. She didn't waver in her principles, even when it cost her. That consistency made her dangerous to someone like Karoline, who thrived on exploiting weakness and inconsistency. Crockett gave her nothing to work with, and in politics, nothing can be more devastating than silence that refuses to bend. So when she sat across from Karoline, refusing to drop the lawsuit, her reaction wasn't malice. It wasn't spite. It was the natural extension of everything she had lived through. Crockett wasn't punishing. She was affirming that insults have consequences, that dignity demands accountability, and that not every battle can be won with charm or bravado. Her ice-cold response in that room came not from cruelty, but from clarity. She knew the weight of the moment. She knew it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone watching, everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been told to take it and move on. By refusing to flinch, she carried them all with her, and that's what made her different. Karoline played for applause. Jasmine played for legacy. Karoline wanted to win the moment. Jasmine wanted to change the standard. One measured her worth in headlines. The other measured it in principles that couldn't be bought or begged away. It was inevitable, then, that the two would collide. On one side, a woman who had coasted on arrogance. On the other, a woman who had endured real battles and come out sharper, calmer, stronger. The stage was set, the contrast unavoidable. And when these two women finally collided, the sparks were unlike anything America had seen before. The moment the two women sat across from each other, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just another political spat. It felt heavier, charged, like the kind of encounter that would be replayed in news clips and memes for years. Cameras rolled, microphones hummed, and Karoline Leavitt, so often sharp and commanding, opened her mouth with a voice that betrayed her. The tremor was unmistakable. "Jasmine, please," she began, her tone far from the clipped confidence she had once wielded, like a blade. "This doesn't have to go this far. 80 million. It's not reasonable. It's not fair. You're trying to destroy me." Her words cracked under the weight of her own fear. The audience leaned in. Here was Karoline, who had once thrown insults with the ease of tossing confetti, now sounding like she was choking on every syllable. Each attempt to frame the lawsuit as excessive only magnified her desperation. Crockett didn't move. She didn't rush to respond. She didn't soften her gaze. She sat, back straight, eyes locked, her silence sharper than any rebuttal. The longer she said nothing, the louder Leavitt's desperation seemed to echo. Silence can be suffocating when you expect noise, and in that room, silence became judgment. Karoline's pleas quickened, almost frantic. "Think about what this looks like. Think about what it means. For politics, for us as women. This isn't justice, it's vengeance." The words spilled out with the rhythm of someone who knew they were losing control of the narrative. She reached for solidarity, tried to invoke shared identity, but the attempt rang hollow. The irony was too thick. The same woman who once sneered at diversity, now clutching it like a lifeline. Crockett's eyes narrowed, but her lips didn't part. The refusal to engage was devastating. It made Leavitt appear smaller with each passing second. The imbalance grew visible, one unraveling in real time, the other anchored in unshakable conviction, and the audience felt it. A low murmur rippled through the room. Gasps punctuated the silence between Karoline's increasingly frantic appeals. Some shook their heads, stunned by the transformation. Others smirked, unable to hide the satisfaction of watching arrogance buckle under the weight of consequence. On social media, the moment was already being clipped and shared. Leavitt's quivering voice against Crockett's stone-cold silence. Finally, Karoline leaned forward, her voice dropping into a whisper that carried through the microphones anyway. "Please, Jasmine, don't do this. You know I can't survive this." And still, nothing. No response. Just that piercing stare, that calm refusal to dignify the plea with even a syllable. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Crockett understood that words were unnecessary. The power wasn't in responding. It was in not responding. The tension grew unbearable. Viewers at home clutched the edges of their seats. Commentators watching live scribbled frantically in their notes. The imbalance of energy between the two, women was magnetic, Leavitt unraveling with each breath, and Crockett becoming stronger precisely because she didn't move, didn't waver, didn't bend. For Karoline, every word was an attempt to claw back control. For Jasmine, every second of silence was proof that control was already hers. And then it happened. The moment that would be replayed, retweeted, remembered. Karoline's voice cracked for the final time, her plea collapsing into near incoherence. Crockett leaned ever so slightly forward, not to speak, but to make her presence even more undeniable. The entire room froze. The silence roared. The clash was no longer about words. It was about who could withstand the pressure. One woman crumbling, the other unshaken. One begging, the other embodying judgment itself. And just as the audience thought they had seen the full extent of the drama, the stage was set for the moment that would eclipse everything. The mic drop heard across the country. For what felt like an eternity, Jasmine Crockett had sat in silence, letting Karoline Leavitt's words collapse under their own weight. The begging, the appeals to fairness, the whispered pleas. It all hung in the air like smoke in a closed room. And then, with the precision of someone who knew timing was everything, Crockett finally moved. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked with Karoline's, and delivered words so sharp and deliberate that they cut more deeply than any insult could. "Karoline," she said, her tone calm, even, almost surgical. "Accountability isn't vengeance. It's the consequence you never thought would come." The pause afterward was deafening. She let the sentence breathe, let it echo. In that pause, the audience gasped, the cameras zoomed closer, and Leavitt's face faltered. It was a simple statement, not a monologue, but it carried the weight of a gavel striking wood. Crockett continued, measured, every word like a scalpel. "You stood in front of America, time and time again, and treated cruelty like strength. You thought dismissing people's identities, their dignity, their struggles would make you untouchable, but you are not untouchable. No one is." Leavitt's hands gripped the table, knuckles blanching. The confidence she once wielded like a weapon slipped through her fingers with every syllable Crockett spoke. She opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but the words died before they formed. Crockett didn't rush. She let silence punctuate her delivery like exclamation points. $80 million, she said softly, almost like she was repeating a fact, not a threat. That's not just a number. That's a reminder that words matter, actions matter, and when you cross the line, there is always a price. Gasps again rippled through the crowd. The room itself, seemed to tilt in Crockett's direction. Leavitt shifted uncomfortably, her hand brushing her hair, her face pale beneath the studio lights. The camera cut to her expression. Wide eyes, lips pressed thin, a woman realizing she was not in control anymore. For years, she had dominated conversations with volume and bravado, but against Crockett's calm, measured strikes, she looked like a fighter swinging wildly in the dark, missing every punch. On social media, the reaction was instantaneous. Tweets exploded across timelines. "This is a masterclass in calm destruction." Crockett didn't raise her voice once, and she just ended Leavitt's career. Karoline begged. Crockett cut her down with one sentence. Memes began forming before the exchange had even finished. Side-by-side images of Leavitt's trembling plea and Crockett's icy glare went viral with captions like, "When arrogance meets reality." Clips of Crockett saying, "Accountability isn't vengeance," were looped on repeat, instantly immortalized as one of those political mic drops that transcended the moment. Leavitt tried to gather herself, forcing a smile that twitched at the edges. She attempted to fire back, voice quivering. This is political theatre, Jasmine. You're just putting on a show." But the delivery fell flat. No one believed her. The room didn't buy it. Even her own tone betrayed her, wobbling under the weight of humiliation. Crockett's reply came like a second strike in the ring. "Theatre?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Karoline, you've mistaken your own performance for politics. This isn't theatre. This is truth." It landed with the force of a knockout punch. Leavitt's lips parted, but nothing came out. She blinked, searching for words that refused to arrive. Her shoulders slumped, her practiced posture giving way to the posture of someone cornered. The commentators watching live struggled to keep up. "We are witnessing something extraordinary here," one whispered. "This is not the Karoline Leavitt, and we've seen before. This is someone unraveling on live television." Every pause Crockett delivered was deliberate, letting the audience fill in the silence with their own judgment. And in that silence, Leavitt's desperation became more visible. She fiddled with her hands, her eyes darting, her breath shallow. The contrast was brutal. Crockett, composed and steady, versus Leavitt, unraveling thread by thread. Crockett ended her statement with a final devastating line. "You asked me to show mercy, but mercy belongs to those who admit fault, not those who beg when they're cornered. Actions have consequences. You taught America to expect less. I refuse to give America less." The words landed like a final blow. The audience audibly gasped, some even clapping before realizing how inappropriate applause might seem in the moment. Still, the energy was undeniable. Crockett had not only responded, she had owned the stage. Leavitt, meanwhile, was reeling. Her face betrayed the collapse she tried to mask. Her fingers tapped nervously against the desk. Her throat tightened, with the effort of swallowing what felt like defeat. For a woman who had once styled herself as invincible, the unraveling was painful to watch and impossible to look away from. Online, the verdict was already sealed. Hashtags like "One Crockett Mic Drop" and "Uasha 80 million reasons" began trending within minutes. Users wrote things like "Karoline walked into that room with arrogance and left with nothing," and "Jasmine Crockett just gave us the blueprint. Calm, precise, devastating." The exchange had the rhythm of a boxing match. Crockett had landed the cleanest punches, never wasting energy, never swinging wildly. Leavitt, by contrast, looked like a fighter staggering after every blow, her defenses failing, her energy draining. Each pause, each stare, Each calm sentence from Crockett hit harder than any shouted retort could have. And then, as the silence stretched one final time, the reality of the moment settled over the room. Karoline Leavitt, once untouchable, was shaken to her core. Her hands trembled visibly now. Her attempt at a smile collapsed into a grimace, and her eyes betrayed the truth. She had been dismantled in front of the entire country. And just when Karoline thought it couldn't get worse, the aftermath proved her wrong. The confrontation ended in silence, but the silence didn't last long. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere, on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, blasted across television networks that normally wouldn't even share the same headline. Karoline Leavitt's desperate plea paired against Jasmine Crockett's cold, devastating words became the split-screen image of the day. Hashtags like "or 80 million reasons," or "Crockett mic drop," and "begging on camera" surged to the top of the trending list before the studio lights had even cooled. On social media, the narrative was clear. Crockett had stood her ground with dignity, while Leavitt unraveled before the nation's eyes. One viral tweet read, "Jasmine Crockett just did more for accountability in 2 sentences than most politicians do in a lifetime." Another, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes, mocked Leavitt's pleas with the caption, "From smug to shook in under 60 seconds." Commentators scrambled to keep pace with the firestorm. On one side of the political spectrum, pundits marveled at Crockett's poise. What we saw, one analyst declared, was not just a debate moment, it was a cultural reset. Crockett turned the art of silence into a weapon, and Karoline Leavitt had no defense. On the other side, defenders of Leavitt struggled to spin the humiliation, some claiming the lawsuit was politically motivated, others insisting the figure was excessive. But their words felt hollow against the stark image of a woman begging, on camera, her opponent unshaken. Celebrities quickly joined the chorus. Actors, musicians, and athletes reposted the clip with captions praising Crockett's restraint and strength. One late-night host joked, "Forget courtrooms, just give Jasmine Crockett a microphone and a stare, and the truth delivers itself." Memes exploded. Screenshots of Crockett's glare became reaction images for everything from ignoring an ex's texts to refusing to back down at work. For Karoline, the damage was immediate and brutal. Allies who once touted her as a rising star grew quiet. Rivals in her own party seized the opportunity to distance themselves, hinting that maybe she had been more trouble than she was worth all along. The aura of invincibility she once cultivated was shattered. Donors whispered about pulling support, strategists openly questioned her future, and the words "career ending" floated across headlines like vultures circling overhead. Meanwhile, Crockett's star only rose. News anchors replayed her calm takedown with admiration. Editorials framed her as the embodiment of dignity in the face of arrogance. She wasn't just being praised for what she said. She was being praised for what she refused to do: shout, flail, or demean herself. Her silence had carried more weight than Karoline's entire plea, and America had noticed. The ripple effects spread beyond the 2 women. Commentators argued this was a turning point in how political accountability would be measured. It wasn't just about the lawsuit anymore. It was about the expectation that arrogance, mockery, and cruelty could no longer be dismissed as just politics. Crockett's refusal to fold signaled a new precedent. That dignity could stand its ground and win. For younger politicians watching, the message was stark. Some saw Crockett as a model, proof that strength didn't require volume. Others saw Leavitt as a cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance without substance eventually collapses under its own weight. The lesson was clear. Politics was shifting, and image alone could no longer protect you when the receipts of your behavior arrived. And as the debate replayed across living rooms, phones, and laptops, the reactions went beyond laughter or schadenfreude. For many, especially immigrants and women of color, the moment felt vindicating. Crockett's calm refusal wasn't just about Karoline. It was about all the times dignity had been dismissed, all the times identity had been mocked, all the times arrogance had gone unchecked. In her silence, people saw themselves. In her words, they heard validation. By nightfall, the clash had eclipsed every other story. Cable news ran endless loops of the exchange, panel after panel dissecting every second of Crockett's body language, every flicker of Leavitt's face. Op-eds poured in, some calling it a masterclass, others labeling it a political funeral. But the conclusion was inescapable. Something larger had shifted. Karoline Leavitt had begged. Jasmine Crockett had stood firm. And the shockwaves of that moment reached far beyond the walls of the studio. But the real story wasn't about who won the moment. It was about what it revealed about America itself. In the end, the clash between Karoline Leavitt and Jasmine Crockett wasn't really about $80 million. It wasn't about legal filings or the mechanics of a lawsuit. It was about something far deeper, something that cuts to the core of what America claims to value. On one side stood desperation, a voice cracking, pleading, clinging to reputation like a lifeline. On the other stood dignity, silent, composed, unshaken by intimidation or theatrics. That contrast is why the moment burned into the nation's memory. It wasn't simply that Crockett refused to yield. It was the way she refused. She didn't rise to the bait, didn't match panic with panic, didn't let arrogance dictate the tempo. Instead, she revealed that true power is not in volume but in presence. When arrogance collapsed into begging, dignity held the line, and dignity won. For Karoline, the performance of strength had always been her shield. The smugness, the bravado, the quick insults. It was all theatre designed to project dominance. But when the curtain fell and the begging began, the performance dissolved. The mask slipped. And what was left was not power, but fear. Fear of accountability, fear of exposure, fear of the consequences arrogance can't outrun. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, embodied a different tradition, the tradition of resilience forged not in comfort, but in struggle. Her silence wasn't cold for cruelty's sake. It was cold because it was strong. She had been through storms that Karoline could not imagine, and she had learned that composure in the face of chaos speaks louder than any shouted defense. She showed that principle, has a gravity arrogance cannot counter. And so this moment stretched beyond the two women. It became symbolic. It became the reminder that in a country where insults often drown out ideas, where arrogance too often masquerades as strength, there is still room for dignity to stand tall. Crockett's stare was not just a personal rebuke, it was a mirror held up to the nation. A mirror asking, what do we reward? Who do we admire? Do we cheer the arrogance that crumbles or the dignity that endures? The answer was written in the reactions. Millions found themselves uplifted, not because they saw someone win a spat, but because they saw someone hold to principle when it mattered most. They saw proof that justice does not require theatrics, that intimidation can be met with poise, and that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones left unspoken. Because in the end, it's not money that wins, it's not begging, it's dignity. Dignity that refuses to bend when insulted. Dignity that does not compromise when pressured. Dignity that speaks not only for itself, but for everyone who has ever been underestimated, mocked, or dismissed. That was the true victory Jasmine Crockett delivered, not just over Karoline Leavitt, but over the culture of arrogance itself. This is why people shared the clip. This is why hashtags exploded and commentators leaned in with awe. They weren't just replaying a political skirmish, they were replaying a moral lesson. They were replaying the feeling of watching truth outlast deceit, principle outshine desperation, and for many it felt like hope. Because America needs reminders like this. That strength isn't loudness, that leadership isn't bullying, that justice doesn't beg, it stands. Crockett's cold, calm refusal gave that reminder, and in giving it, she carved her name not just into a headline, but into a broader narrative about what this country can still be when it chooses dignity over arrogance. And as the dust settled, one truth remained undeniable. This wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's moment. It was a moment for everyone who believes that holding the line matters. A moment for everyone who knows that in the fight between desperation and dignity, dignity must always prevail. Because the echo of that exchange was larger than politics. It was a lesson America could not afford to ignore. Karoline Leavitt begged. Her voice cracked, her words stumbled, and the number, $80 million, hung in the air like a sentence too heavy to bear. But Jasmine Crockett's cold refusal, her unflinching silence, echoed louder than any plea. That image, the desperate unraveling of arrogance against the calm strength of dignity, spread across America, leaving the nation stunned. This wasn't just about a lawsuit. It wasn't just about two women caught in a clash of pride and power. It was about what those women came to symbolize in that moment. One embodied the fragility of arrogance, the truth that desperation always reveals the cracks in false strength. The other embodied the timeless power of principle, unshaken, authentic, unwilling to bend even when the stakes seemed overwhelming. That's why America couldn't look away. Because deep down, we know these moments matter. They remind us of who we are and who we aspire to be. They force us to ask, when pressure mounts, do we crumble into pleading, or do we stand in dignity? Do we chase validation through noise, or do we claim strength through authenticity? And here's the truth. These moments don't just define politicians. They define all of us. Every community, every family, every person who has ever been underestimated or pressured into silence. Crockett's refusal wasn't only her victory, it was a victory for dignity itself. So if you believe dignity should always outweigh arrogance, if you believe authenticity should always outshine desperation, then this is your call. Subscribe, share this story. Add your voice to the chorus that says dignity still matters in America. Because in the end, these moments are not just political theatre. They are the story of who we are as a nation and who we choose to become.